Justice doesn't fail because people don't care. It fails when the systems designed to deliver it stop working. Hey, I'm Stephen Teskey, retired judge, and this is Justice Redesign, a podcast about rethinking justice, challenging assumptions, and rebuilding the systems that shape people's lives. And coming up is episode 9 in our series examining the legal, economic, and institutional dimensions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known, of course, as DEI. Each installment addresses a different layer of the debate, from merit and neutrality to profitability and governance, with the aim of separating rhetoric from reality. And the next episode is called Beyond the Business Case, from correlation debates to institutional architecture. Stay tuned, because real justice doesn't happen by accident. It happens when, well, we're willing to rethink the systems behind it. So, apparently the spreadsheet isn't sacred anymore. For years, the pro-DEI crowd waved around McKinsey studies like stone tablets. Top quartile diversity equals higher profitability. And then critics showed up and said, correlation is not causation. And honestly, they're right. Correlation is not causation. But here's where the analysis usually stops. Like someone who spotted a crack in the foundation and concluded the entire house must be, well, imaginary. The real question was never, does diversity magically cause profit? The real question is, does exclusion create waste? And waste, folks, is expensive. DEI is not what many people think it is. Let me pause here for a moment, okay? Because I know some listeners are still hearing the letters D, E, and I and translating them into something else. They hear DEI and they think quotas. And they hear DEI and they think affirmative action and think reverse discrimination against white people. But those terms are not interchangeable. And if we confuse them, we can't have an honest conversation. Affirmative action emerged in the 1960s as a remedial framework. Its purpose was to confront the reality that entire groups of people have been systemically locked out of education and employment. It was proactive. It was corrective. You know what? And it was needed in that day, folks. I mean, you're talking about the Jim Crow laws that even after they were outlawed in Brown versus Board of Education, the practice still continued, mostly in the South. And so with that said, it had to be proactive. And yes, it involved measurable outcomes tied to representation. See, DEI is different. Modern DEI, at least when done properly, and that's a very important operative word, properly. I'm going to talk more about that. And we already have in some of the previous episodes, but it's not primarily about getting someone in the door. It is about what happens after the door opens. And that's where it's so distinctly different from affirmative action, is because it's not about getting people in the door as much as many people think that it is today. Like I said, it's about once you get people in the door, how do you keep them? See, it asks, are hiring systems broad enough to find talent, okay? Are evaluations fair and consistent? And promotion pathways, are they transparent? And do people feel, trusted enough to contribute to ideas? Do high performers stay or quietly leave, right? That's not a quota system, ladies and gentlemen. That's organizational design. And let's be clear about something else. Quotas are generally illegal, by the way, okay? So no Fortune 500 legal department wakes up and says, How can we get sued creatively today? Come on, folks. No serious company lawyer is sitting in a boardroom saying, hey, let's violate federal law before lunch today, okay? What organizations actually do is set goals. They track patterns. They examine bottlenecks and ask whether they're overlooking qualified people. That's what every competent institution or every competent institution should do in every other area of performance. We call it metrics. We call it management. We call it governance. But when it involves people, suddenly some call it discrimination. And here's the deeper truth. The value of DEI is not in diversity alone, as many people make it out to be. It's like DEI and people talk as if the D is the only thing in DEI. The value is actually inclusion, because without inclusion, diversity becomes a revolving door. People get hired, then leave. Talent enters, then leaks out. Ideas arrive, and then they get ignored. That's not equity, folks. That's waste. And waste is expensive. Studies consistently show that employees are more likely to stay where they feel respected, trusted, and able to grow. I mean, come on, folks, that's not a shocker, okay? No one wants to work at a place that treats them disrespectfully, unfairly. It benefits everyone, not just one demographic group, right? Not just one demographic group. Lower turnover, better collaboration, more innovation, stronger performance. So no, properly designed DEI is not the opposite of merit. It is an attempt to build systems where merit is easier to recognize, easier to retain, and harder to waste. Now, with that clarified, let's ask the real question, okay? The anti-DEI critic says this: profitable companies can afford diversity. Maybe, all right? But that's like saying healthy people can afford vegetables. That doesn't mean vegetables are irrelevant. It means you're asking the wrong question. Instead of debating whether diversity causes profit, we should be asking, what happens when your hiring system filters out talent because it feels unfamiliar? What happens when promotion pipelines stall for certain groups? What happens when high-performing employees leave because they don't see a future? That's not ideology. That's leakage. And leakage costs money. Think about this for a moment. Let's kind of do a reality check here. If a company loses talented employees at higher rates because they feel excluded, that's not social justice, folks. That's turnover cost. If groupthink blinds leadership to emerging markets, that's not culture war. That's strategic failure. If bias prevents the best ideas from surfacing, that's not politics. That's inefficiency. Okay, let's clean up a misunderstanding here. Diversity is not the strategy. Inclusion is. What does it take to get that through all of our heads? Diversity is what you get. Inclusion is what you build. Equity is the result. When critics mock diversity theater, they're sometimes right. Slapping a slogan on a website, mandatory 1-hour training? Come on. Hiring a consultant to change fonts? You gotta be kidding me. That's not architecture. That's decor. But inclusion, done right, that's system design, structured interviews, okay? Bias audits, transparent promotion metrics, retention analysis. That's engineering. And engineering doesn't rely on correlation. It relies on diagnostics. Now, let's take this one step further. If inclusion is not about optics, but about how systems function, then we should be able to describe it the same way we describe any well-designed system in terms of inputs, outputs, and efficiency. And I'll tell you, this is something I know about. I've got my master's in political science, and my emphasis was on systems theory. And so with that said, because what we're really talking about here is not diversity as a goal, right? Okay. Although many have created this narrative, that's what it is. It's not. But inclusion as an architecture, okay? It's the builder, the kind of architecture that determines who gets in the room, who gets heard, and who stays long enough to contribute. Look, almost 10 years ago, Dr. Tony Byers, a DEI consultant, was critiquing DEI programs for not doing it right. In other words, Dr. Byers recognized the insanity in doing the same thing over and over concerning how DEI is done, but expecting different results. Something he said was insanity, right? And he said this long before a YouTube video came out, critical of the notion that diversity produces good outcomes in businesses. Dr. Byers was telling the world 10 years ago, folks, that it is not diversity that drives profit. It is inclusion that drives profit. It is doing inclusion right that drives profits. This is not new. So let's listen to Dr. Byers himself, okay? Explain why focusing on diversity alone misses the point and why inclusion is the mechanism that actually drives results. Listen to him, please.
This is what we know that we can achieve. Those organizations that practice diversity and inclusion outperform their peers on the S&P marketplace by about 26%, according to Diversity Inc.'s top 50 companies for diversity. Fascinating, right? You look at the Center for Talent Innovation, they did a study of about 600 or 700 companies, and they said, well, you know what? Those companies that actually practice inclusion well, they're 45% more likely to grow in their current market, 70% more likely to capture new market growth. And those companies that practice diversity and inclusion well, they're able to look at getting the 2.3 times utilization of their mind share of their employees versus not. Compelling argument or compelling reasons for us to think about diversity and inclusion, and one in which I'm like, all right, this is good stuff, but what does it mean to do it well? That's actually the critical question. Everyone talks about this stuff, but what does it mean to do it well? Somewhere out there has to be a factor that we can actually just look at and say, that's it. Capturing that, getting more of this can actually start to move us to that direction. And this is what I'm trying to uncover. Someone talked about effectiveness in teams, and I was sharing the story a little bit earlier, and I like to tell the story backwards. And this tries to capture the difference between a multicultural team and then or a single culture team. And as you can see on the far left, the multicultural team has a degree of effectiveness. When they get to the middle, you see a single cultural group. So what this is telling us is that a homogeneous group actually outperforms a diverse group. That's exactly what this chart is telling us so far, right? But when you get to the other side, on the right side of the curve, what you see is that these cross-cultural groups that are managed well actually outperform a homogeneous group and or a diverse group. And this talks and speaks to something that I think is important, because we talk about diversity a lot, but when I try to remember, and if you do this wrong, leaders will just say, go out and get me some people and bring them in here and let's make sure they're the right people, but you actually have to do something else. What we've discovered is that diversity doesn't get the benefits you want unless you manage it well. Diversity doesn't work without inclusion. Inclusion becomes an increasingly important factor of how we get the benefits of what we say a diverse team will bring once we start to have inclusion. And so if we keep pushing this and pushing this and pushing this, and we start thinking about, man, what are those behaviors we need to have in order to practice inclusion? Well, I'm playing with 3 of them right now, and I'd like to share them with you. And perhaps you've seen these work or take place inside of your organization, and about a year from now, I'd love to come back and tell you how it's working inside of our organization. One is that we need to move from awareness of differences to the utilization of differences to drive innovation and growth. In a growth-based company, it is really, really important that we get to the point about how we're utilizing talent. I don't want to know how you feel. I want to know what you're doing to drive business results. That's a rough thing for me to have to say as a diversity and inclusion practitioner. I hope none of my colleagues are here. Because when I talk to my business leaders, I'm telling them that, well, but when people feel good, they're going to give you the business results. And then they're looking at me, they're saying, yeah, but right now I really care about these business results. Can we talk about when people feel good after I talk about these business results? And so now I'm at the point where I'm saying, hey, you just don't get the growth. If you want to grow your company, then you need to practice these skills. Every company is concerned about market success. We're concerned about it from a growth perspective. And the process by this is that you have to have effective products and services times great ideas and innovation. You need that, right? Without it, you're not going to get any market success. What I'm arguing is that if you multiply this times inclusion, what you're going to see is what they were talking about, 26% in terms of outperforming their peers on the S&P market. There's a differentiator there that this is talking about diversity and inclusion and how we use this as a multiplier to get higher levels of performance. Now, as my time runs out, I wanted to show you just a couple of other things, how the results of a few multipliers who've been able to impact the marketplace. And I'm not even using my own company at this point in time. What I'm showing you right now is products and services that were created for consumers that were internally driven by having a diverse and inclusive speak up culture. These things were not created from the outside, created from the inside. And once you start to see what's the process of that, there's a story behind each one in terms of what they were able to do on their sales over a 12-month, year-over-year period. Their comps in just about every category had a positive increase. And all they had to do is turn around and tap the talent that they have right in front of them. This whole thing about multiplier and inclusion and what's important and what's valuable, there are a lot of different things that I still have yet to prove with all different types of data points. But what I can say is if you think about it, how do multipliers impact your people, your products and services, your brand, and your marketplace? And that if you practice these behaviors of moving from awareness to utilization of differences, to understanding the unconscious mindsets or biases that you have as a leader, and you ask those leaders to drive cultures that promote inclusion, that are speak up so you don't have what you see, this is what you can expect to see. Some profits, market growth, market capitalization, those things that all of my top level executives care about a lot more than some of the other things that I have to talk to them about.
Or fails to retain high performers, then the problem isn't the lack of diversity. The problem is how the system is designed. That's what he means by inclusion as architecture, not slogans, not training sessions, not what I called earlier diversity decor, but structures, how people are hired, how they are evaluated, and whether they stay. Because when those systems work properly, something predictable happens. You waste less talent. And when you waste less talent, performance improves. It goes without saying. Not because diversity is some kind of magic formula. It's not. But because inefficiency has been reduced. And that brings us, back to the real issue. The debate was never really about whether diversity causes profit. The debate should have been about whether poorly designed systems are quietly driving talent out the door. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because the idea that better outcomes come from open, competitive systems isn't new. It's the same principle that underlies the Constitution's marketplace of ideas. I've spoken about this before. So let me put it to you in terms I understand as a judge, and a person who did and worked his master's thesis on free speech theory, which is about the marketplace of ideas. A system only works when the best ideas are allowed to surface, and the weakest ideas are allowed to be tested, not protected, not shielded, just tested. That principle didn't originate in business schools. It didn't come from corporate strategy. It is embedded in the Constitution itself, the First Amendment. It protects what has been called the marketplace of ideas, not because it's polite, but because it's practical. Because when ideas are allowed to compete, better outcomes are going to emerge. And when certain voices are excluded, when certain perspectives never make it into the room, that marketplace stops functioning. It becomes curated. And a curated marketplace is not a free one. As constitutional scholar Alexander Meiklejohn argued, the First Amendment is not just about individual expression, it's about ensuring that society has access to the full range of ideas necessary for self-government. And once you understand that principle, that systems work best when ideas are allowed to compete. The next question isn't philosophical, it's practical. How do you measure whether your system is actually working? So, in a previous episode, I discussed the YouTube analysis that correctly pointed out a flaw in the DEI debate. Correlation is not causation. And as I said earlier, that's true, but it's also incomplete. Because once you move past that observation, the real question isn't whether diversity causes profit. It's whether your system is quietly wasting talent. But I also pointed out in what way the YouTube causality critique missed the final step. Because you see, it said, McKinsey doesn't prove diversity causes profit. Okay, correct. But the smarter move is this. Stop selling diversity as a magic revenue booster. Start measuring bias as waste. Precision DEI doesn't ask, did our diversity percentage go up? No, because it doesn't matter. It asks, where are we losing talent? Where are promotional bottlenecks? Which departments hemorrhage high performers? You see, that's not correlation. And that's really accounting. And when you eliminate waste, profit tends to follow. Not because diversity is mystical, because inefficiency is expensive. Let's take this one step further. If the real issue isn't whether diversity causes profit, but whether systems are quietly wasting talent, then the question becomes, where does that waste actually occur? Because waste in organizations doesn't usually announce itself. It shows up in less obvious ways. High performers who leave, ideas that never surface, opportunities that are missed because no one in the room sees them. Let's listen to Mr. Gaudiano explain, who's an expert in this DEI and actually works with companies, okay, that focuses on the inclusion and how to build a system driven by inclusion, not diversity, but inclusion. But let's listen to how the absence of inclusion creates exactly that kind of hidden waste. Listen.
But let's talk about that idea. Inclusion is what you do. Imagine a team that's the perfect team. You cannot get any more performance out of it because each individual performs at their peak and is a team that perform really, really well together. And imagine that now something happens so that one of the people on the team is unable to perform at their peak. What will happen to the performance of the team as a whole? It will decline. Suppose that now a second person is unable to perform at their peak. Not only is the team going to lose more performance because of the loss of the second individual, but the rest of the team is going to get frustrated because they have to pick up the slack, because they'll be late on delivering a project and their manager will say, oh, we're no longer going to give you the best projects. That means that pretty soon the performance of the entire team will decline dramatically because of that problem. Now, I didn't say anything about what the people on the team look like or what they did or why they were not able to work, but it leads to a profoundly important conclusion. Anything that any organization does that causes someone to feel excluded because of their personal characteristics is shooting themselves in the foot. This is a very important point. This is why the third part, which is that equity is what you want. If you have an organization in which you have people that are treated differently, and you see it because you see that the retention rates are not the same, that the performance is not the same, you are witnessing inequity. You're witnessing in the difference in the outcomes that people experience within your organization. When you see that happen, it means that there are people that are performing below their peak. And just like that example that I gave you, it means that you're making less money because you have less productivity. It also means that those people do not feel that they belong in your organization and they're going to leave. If the retention rate of men in your organization is 90%, but the retention of women is only 80%, that means that you're losing 10% too many women. If your company has 1,000 women, which is not a very big company, and you're paying them an average of $100,000 a year, and we know that it costs about 1 year's salary to replace them, it means that you have lost 100 people, and it's going to cost you $100,000 each. That's $10 million a year that you're throwing out the window because you're not treating women inclusively. And the same is true of people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ. We have created a way of measuring inclusion, and this is where things get really interesting. Why are people so obsessed with measuring diversity only? Because it turns out that really, we talk about DI, but look outside, look around, you look at any company, they just measure the D. Why? Reason number one, because it's much easier to define, right? You just ask people, do you belong in this category, in that category, and you count them. When it comes to inclusion, the most popular definition that I've heard, and there are many out there, was the one given by Vernee Myers, formerly of Netflix, who said, diversity is being invited to a party, inclusion is being asked to dance. I love the definition because it's very intuitive, but if you're running a company, unless it's a party company, it's not going to help you very much. When it came to understanding what I told you earlier, that inclusion is about what you do and diversity is what you get, and we started to investigate that, we realized something profoundly important. Inclusion is invisible. It's just like privilege. We don't see it. Those of us that are fortunate enough to have it. And I use the analogy with health. When I introduced myself, I didn't say, hi, I'm Paolo. I'm very healthy today. But if I'd been coughing, if I just had COVID, if I had, I don't know, a few years ago, I fell off a bike and I had a cast on my shoulder, I might have said something about it. We don't notice when we're healthy, we notice when we're sick. We don't tend to notice when we're included, but we sure as hell notice when we're being excluded. And we've heard a lot of examples from the other speakers about situations in which people felt excluded. What does that tell you? Well, something very important. If you're very healthy, you tend not to know a lot about diseases. You may not even know the names of the diseases. You don't know the symptoms. You certainly don't know how to cure them. So similarly, if you're very included, you don't know what exclusion means. You don't know the symptoms, and you sure as hell don't know how to fix it. However, if I were to ask people in this audience, if anybody in this audience has ever been sick, probably all of you know what that's like. But if you go in a company and you find out who are the people that are the most included, it's the leaders. It's the ones that look like me, who are the least qualified to understand it, to see it, and most importantly, to know what they should do about it. And this is a profound problem.
What Gaudiano is describing is something most organizations don't measure very well. Not because it's unimportant, not because it's harder to see. We're used to measuring revenue, ladies and gentlemen, profit margins, market share, but we're much less precise when it comes to measuring loss, especially the loss of human potential. And that's what exclusion does. It doesn't just affect culture. It creates leakage, talent that never gets hired, talent that never gets promoted, talent that leaves because the system doesn't work for them. And when that happens, the organization isn't just less diverse, it's less effective because it is operating with a smaller, narrower, and less informed set of ideas. And that has consequences. Not ideological consequences, but operational ones. Because when blind spots increase, mistakes increase. And folks, mistakes are expensive. But let's look at it this way. Another reality check here. Markets punish inefficiency. They have to. Inefficiency is lost profits. And the goal is to increase profits. They don't care about ideology. If inclusion reduces turnover, reduces blind spots, reduces strategic mistakes, then abandoning inclusion for political optics isn't principled. It's expensive. Let's get blunt. Boards are fiduciaries. Talent is a primary asset. If you shrink your talent pool because someone on cable news yelled about DEI, that's not neutrality. That's asset mismanagement. Corporations may change the acronym. They may rebrand the department. They may whisper instead of shout, but they are not voluntarily shrinking their competitive advantage because markets don't reward homogeneity. They tax it. Hello, the homogeneity tax. We'll get there, okay? The YouTube analysis made one responsible move. It warned people not to run its findings and declare DEI dead. And I appreciate that. But it stopped one step short. It didn't ask, why do high-performing companies adopt inclusion systems? Well, it's probably because they weren't looking at inclusion. They were just looking at diversity. So think about that. Maybe it didn't examine how bias-resistant processes protect talent assets. Or maybe it didn't explore how inclusion mitigates risks rather than manufactures profits. The debate got stuck at causality, and the real action is not causality, it's architecture. In closing, ladies and gentlemen, the business case for inclusion was never about a magical diversity bonus. It was about building systems capable of finding, keeping, and empowering the best talent available. Correlation may have opened the door, but architecture is what keeps it standing, because when systems are designed to waste less talent, surface more ideas, and reduce blind spots, performance isn't a mystery, it's a result. And when critics reduce that to a spreadsheet gotcha, they're arguing about the wrong variable. The question was never whether diversity causes profit. I don't know how many times I have to repeat that, because there's this narrative out there that is what DEI does by focusing only on diversity, by who comes into the door. But if you focus on inclusion, okay, where people feel respected, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their ethnicity, their religion, their gender, okay, whether they're LGBTQ, they're going to stay, okay? And everyone has talent in the sense that of these categories. It's not like white people have more talent than black people or brown people or vice versa, okay, or women, all right, unless you really are a bigot, okay, you know. But most people, they know in the world today how much talent there is out there among all people of all kinds and gender and sexual orientation, okay? So the question is whether your system is designed to waste less human potential. And for serious institutions, that's not ideological, it's fiduciary. The people we do get in the door, we want to make sure we keep them, because it's the fiduciary thing to do in protecting our shareholders, protecting the CEO of the company, the owner of the company. And right about now, the spreadsheet wanders back into the room. Remember the spreadsheet? I brought it up in the past. The one that doesn't care about culture wars, doesn't scroll social media, doesn't get offended, doesn't attend congressional hearings. It just counts. It counts turnover costs. It counts stalled promotions, okay? It counts the ideas that never made it into the room because everyone in the room thought the same way. And it keeps asking one quiet, relentless question. Where's the waste? When talent leaves because systems are narrow, the spreadsheet notices. When groupthink blinds leadership to risk, the spreadsheet notices. When innovation stalls because dissent never entered the room, the spreadsheet notices. It doesn't celebrate diversity. It doesn't reject it either. It measures performance. And when inclusion reduces waste, the spreadsheet nods quietly. Yeah, good. Because that's what it does. So if the spreadsheet isn't panicking, why is the rhetoric? Come on, ladies and gentlemen. With everything that's going on now in anti-DEI, all companies are doing is just getting rid of the acronym. They're still doing the same thing, but if they're doing it right, they're focusing on inclusion because they cannot afford to waste talented people who are either African American, Hispanic, Indigenous, women. I mean, you can't afford to do that. So inclusion is necessary to make sure we keep that talent. All right. So if inclusion is engineering, why is it being reframed as ideology? And that's not a math problem. That's a narrative strategy. And in the next episode, titled When the Acronym Retreats, we examine what happens when the language changes, but the systems quietly remain. Because when the label disappears, but the work continues, which is what I just described, because good business people are going to keep doing the same thing. They just may change the name just to make this administration happy. You begin to see what was really driving the conversation all along. But thank you for joining me today. And you can receive all my articles and podcasts directly to your email by subscribing to my Substack website at Stephen Teske, all one word, Stephen with a V as in Victor, but it's stephenteske.substack.com. And remember that when outrage becomes selective, justice becomes political. And when justice becomes political, well, everyone eventually loses. Again, I'm Judge Stephen Teske, retired, and this is Justice Redesign, because better justice doesn't happen by accident. It happens when we have the courage to redesign the systems that shape people's lives. Justice isn't fixed. It's redesigned. Y'all take care. Be safe. See you next time.